Chapter 175. Leo Dragonic 2. Squirt. Eugene was hit full in the face with a spout of water. Drops of water went into his eyes, trickled down his cheeks and dripped to the floor. The water got Eugene's collar and the cloak's fur wet, but Eugene let them be for now since he had allowed the boy to spray water on himself. However, while sitting inside the cloak, Mare didn't know that, so her jaw dropped. "Sir Eugene." Mare called Eugene in her mind. Drip, drip. Standing silently, Eugene tasted the water that seeped in through his lips. It was sour. That damn rascal must have mixed vinegar in the water. The sourness inside his mouth and the wetness on his face were so disgusting that Eugene turned his head sideways and spat. Ahaha. Eugene could hear someone bursting into laughter under the bed. Without wiping the water from his face, Eugene looked at the kid that crawled out from under the bed. The 10-year-old kid, Leo Dragonic, had red hair and blue eyes, just like his father. He had a very fit body, which was very unusual for a child, but he still had some baby fat on his round face. The boy was smiling mischievously as he pointed his water gun at Eugene's face. Hee hee. Eugene nodded as he chuckled. Of course, Leo didn't apologize. If he had enough common sense to apologize, he wouldn't have randomly squirted water. No vinegar water with his water gun on a guest. Squirt. Leo used his squirt gun again. Eugene still didn't dodge it. Fush. The stronger spout of water splashed Eugene's lips. That fucking rascal accurately aimed for that little gap between Eugene's closed lips and put vinegar water in his mouth. "You can't even dodge that, mister?" Leo giggled as he swung his squirt gun. Eugene could see Leo had no worries about the aftermath of his action. Sure, this was the Dragonic mansion. The Dragonic patriarch was Alchester Dragonic, and that damn rascal who kept squirting water on Eugene's face was Leo Dragonic. The only people who could scold Leo in this mansion were his parents, but Alchester adored his son, whom he had in his later years, so much that he turned into a big softy around him. Still chuckling, Eugene waved his fingers. Pop. The water drops that dripped to the floor after soaking Eugene's face and clothes began to float in the air one by one. "Whoa!" Leo innocently exclaimed as he watched the sight. "That's magic, right? I heard a lot about you too, mister. You are a great knight, but you are also a powerful wizard, am I right?" After shouting so innocently, Leo slowly put down his squirt gun because he was now unsure about the story he had heard before. Then looking at his squirt gun, then at Eugene and the water drops floating in front of Eugene in succession, Leo mumbled, "But why can't you even dodge an attack from a squirt gun?" Hee hee. Grinning, Eugene flicked his fingers in Leo's direction. "To do this, you son of a bitch." Pop. The water drops instantly flew in Leo's direction and exploded on his face. However, they didn't explode in an ordinary way. Eugene had delicately controlled his mana to shove every water drop into Leo's nose and mouth. Ugh. Wriggling, Leo kept retching. Blarg. Arg. There was no way a 10-year-old kid could have prepared for this kind of attack. As the water drops flowed from his nose to his mouth, the sourness overwhelmed his nose and mouth, making Leo roll around the floor in pain. Eugene came up to Leo, who was still wriggling on the floor. After spending a while rubbing his nose and spitting out the water, Leo swiftly raised his head. The young boy was full of anger as he shouted, "Are you crazy, mister? What have you done to me? Did you use your squirt gun on me because you were crazy? I thought you would avoid my attack. Does that allow you to use your squirt gun on a stranger? And I didn't avoid your attack and got splashed with water, so isn't this self-defense? You are an adult. Age doesn't matter when it comes to taking responsibility for your actions and refraining from doing stupid things. Do you know what I would like to do right now? I want to consider your action as an insult to me and cut you with my sword." Eugene spoke, looking at Leo threateningly. It made Leo's face turn pale. Unable to talk back to Eugene anymore, Leo just looked at the floor as he hunched his shoulders. "But I won't draw my sword since I know your father, Sir Alchester." Eugene tapped Leo's hunched shoulder. Leo didn't respond. "Are you not going to answer me?" Okay, Leo said haltingly. "What happened to my apology?" "I'm sorry." Leo lowered his head, choking up. Mare watched everything from inside the cloak. Eugene was intimidating a 10-year-old kid by acting scary. She wasn't sure what to think of Eugene. No, Hamel, the great hero from 300 years ago. "You're very thorough, Sir Eugene," Mare finally blurted out. Somebody should teach these rascals some manners when they are still young. Thanks to me harassing them when we were young, Cyan and Seal have become decent adults. Yeah, you are great. Mare stayed silent after saying that. After he had pulled up a chair from nearby, Eugene sat in front of the still frightened Leo. Leo kept his eyes on the floor. His eyes were filled with tears, but he desperately held back from crying. Did Sir Alchester tell you to use a squirt gun on me? Eugene tilted his head slightly. No. Then who did? Did somebody else in this mansion tell you to splash the annoying Eugene Lionheart's face with vinegar water? No, I just wanted to shoot you with water, mister. If you call me mister one more time. Not finishing his sentence, Eugene crossed his legs. Leo flinched as he saw Eugene. I'm going to do something much scarier than you can imagine right now. Yes, brother. Leo fervently nodded. So, why did you want to shoot me with water? People told me you are a great knight, so I thought you would dodge my attack, Leo timidly explained. Of course I can avoid your attack. I didn't do so on purpose, Eugene said as he flicked his fingers, straightening Leo's posture. Baffled, Leo looked back and forth between himself and Eugene. What was that? Was it mana? You used mana to move me, right? Huh. Eugene stared at Leo as he raised an eyebrow. He hadn't paid much attention when Alchester bragged about his talented son. Seemed like Leo was talented enough for the best knight of the Empire to be proud of. Oh, wow. Leo exclaimed as he felt a little bit of Eugene's mana nudging his body. It was common for children born in prestigious warrior families to study mana from a young age. Therefore the children often felt mana even though they were young. Even Seal and Cyan had begun to study mana when they were little children. However, Leo sensed mana better than Eugene had thought. He was using a tiny amount of mana to nudge Leo right now. Most knights wouldn't be able to feel Eugene's mana if he used it this way. He wasn't perfect, but Leo was partially sensing Eugene's mana as he moved his body around. He is interesting. Eugene grinned. He was here to contact the dragon, but Leo's talent intrigued him. Holding Akasha inside his cloak, Eugene recalled a magic formula inside his head. He didn't even need to chant. His will was enough to cast the spell. Whoosh. As he focused on Leo, Eugene's view changed a bit. He had used a high-level analysis spell to see Leo's core and mana flow. Eugene used magic but couldn't see Leo's cores or mana flow. Mare tilted her head in confusion too. Showing an aptitude for mana control from a young age wasn't surprising if the child was born and raised in a prestigious warrior family. However, magic resistance was a different story. Eugene had used a 6-circle spell named Detect Eye, but the boy, who wasn't even born from a wizard family, resisted the spell without using resistance magic or an artifact that held the magic. How was this possible? This isn't magic resistance, Mare deduced. I know. If that were the case, Leo would have resisted when Eugene forced the vinegar water into his mouth and nose. Once again Eugene recalled the formula, and Mare assisted him this time. Zing. He focused again, but he still couldn't see Leo's core. Just like Mare had said before, it didn't make sense for Eugene to be unable to see Leo's state at all, no matter how strong Leo's magic resistance was. Was Leo using some kind of magic? No. Eugene couldn't detect any magic right now. He is not doing this on a conscious level. If a 10-year-old kid can nullify magic like this bastard would be Vermouth's reincarnation. Who do you like better, Sir Vermouth or Sir Hamel? Eugene asked. Pardon? Who do you like better? Eugene repeated. I like Sir Oryx Dragonic. There was no way that Vermouth would say such bullshit. Come here. Eugene suddenly gestured to Leo and he approached furtively. When Leo came close enough, Eugene swiftly reached out and snatched Leo's wrist. What is it? Stay still. I need to see your physical condition in order to teach you. Squinting at Leo's face, Eugene made up an excuse as he infused his mana through Leo's wrist. Eugene's mana circulated inside Leo's body without any hindrance. Since Leo had no idea what Eugene was doing, he just blinked. Something is crawling up my arm from my wrist. You are doing this now, right? The analysis spell didn't even work on Leo, but Eugene could infuse his mana into Leo's body without a problem. It was hard to believe, but was Leo just born with great magic resistance? Since Eugene had a hard time believing it, he used Detect Eye once again. Just then Eugene unwittingly let go of Leo's hand, because a shiver suddenly ran down his spine, making Eugene put on a solemn face. When had Eugene felt this? He was sure he had felt this before. Brushing his arms full of goosebumps, Eugene took a step back. Eugene wasn't the only one who had felt it. Mare, who had been analyzing Leo's peculiarity with Eugene from inside the cloak, shrieked. An unfamiliar, foreign sense of intense pressure had frightened Mare, so she buried her head in Eugene's chest. Fear. That was the first word that came to Eugene's mind. Mare had never acted this way when she had met the Demon King's remnant and Iris, even though they also acted hostile, giving off intense pressure. Eugene finally realized what he had just felt. Leo wasn't being hostile or showing a desire to kill, but he was using a skill that paralyzed and scattered the nearby mana, just like a beast's howling petrified its prey. Dragon Fear. Raizakia had used this skill, which could only be used by dragons. With this skill, those arrogant dragons could scatter magic and petrify mana. What's wrong? Leo looked at Eugene in a baffled state because he had just seen Eugene's cloak wiggling and strands of purple hair through the cloak's gap. Although Leo really wanted to ask about the small shriek he had just heard, he stayed quiet because Eugene's face looked solemn. He subconsciously radiates dragon fear, but he can't sense his own fear? Eugene swiftly began to think about what had triggered Leo's dragon fear. Had Leo instinctively reacted to the foreign mana inside his body? How in the world had he done that? The Dragonics Training Center was a dome-shaped building located a little bit far from the Dragonic Mansion. What do you think of my son? Alcester asked with twinkling eyes. I can see why you are so proud of him, Sir Alcester. Watching the spells that filled the building's walls, Eugene continued. He especially has an outstanding aptitude in mana control that made me feel like he is indeed a dragon's heir. While he spoke, Eugene observed Alcester's reaction to see if he revealed anything, but Alcester just smiled wildly when Eugene praised Leo. That made me curious. What are you curious about? Every citizen in the Kiel Empire knows that the first ancestor of the Dragonics, Oryx Dragonic, was a half-dragon. Among his descendants, you, the best knight of the Kiel Empire in this generation, and your son Leo inherited the purest dragon blood, right? Eugene spoke as he continued to observe Alcester's reaction. I'm so grateful and happy to hear that. Feeling touched, Alcester nodded delightedly. 300 years have passed since my first ancestor established the Dragonic clan. The Dragonic clan was founded in the same era as the Lionheart clan, and we continued to live up to Sir Oryx's name. I am not supposed to say these things myself, but I have tried my best to take after my first ancestor who protected Kiel in times of war. It wasn't what Eugene wanted to hear. However, I can't say I'm special, considering how every Dragonic patriarch tried to protect Kiel. Didn't the Lionheart patriarchs also do that? They must have trained themselves to take after the Great Vermouth because they respected him. Eugene listened quietly. I hope my son chooses the same path as me by following a code of chivalry, serving His Majesty as his lord and protecting the Empire. Someday, when my son inherits my position as His Majesty's guard, then Leo will maintain a close relationship with your Lionheart. I'm not a candidate for the patriarch position. Eugene interrupted. Yes, that's right. My bad, but you'll still be a Lionheart then, right? So you and my son will be able to protect Kiel later. Are you able to use Dragon Fear, Sir Alcester? Eugene simply asked, since the conversation was never going to end if Eugene just kept beating around the bush. Dragon Fear. Can you use it? Eugene repeated. Oryx wasn't a half-dragon. He had luckily obtained a dragon heart. Oryx's descendants didn't have the dragon's blood. So how was it possible for Leo to use Dragon Fear? Even if it were possible, could a 10-year-old kid radiate Dragon Fear? When you were talking about Dragon Fear, you were talking about the feeling of intense pressure that a dragon radiates, right? Alcester spoke, baffled. Yes, that's right. Eugene nodded. How can a person radiate Dragon Fear? Alcester asked innocently. But aren't you the descendant of Sir Oryx, the half-dragon? That is right. However, no Dragonic patriarch was able to use Dragon Fear, including me. Eugene listened as Alcester continued. You are a bit similar to Lady Carmen. Eugene swiftly raised his head. No, don't take this the wrong way. I'm aware that you two don't share blood and are very far from each other in the Lionheart family tree. It's just that, you two have a similar personality. What in the world are you talking about? Eugene asked after managing to stop himself from cursing aloud. How could Alchester say Eugene was similar to a woman who couldn't act her age and had a hobby and taste that ordinary people would only enjoy during adolescence? Lady Carmen also asked similar questions in this mansion a long time ago. What were the questions? Eugene was almost scared to ask this. She asked if I could use dragon breath. Eugene didn't know how to respond. She also asked if I was hiding wings in my back and a tail in my bottom, and whether or not a dark dragon was sealed in my right arm. 1. I know I am being really rude, but Lady Carmen is insane, Eugene finally said without blinking. I think she is a very consistent person. Alchester cleared his throat as he stepped back. And I respect her as a knight and a martial artist. Anyhow, so are you unable to use dragon fear? Eugene bitterly asked. I don't know how to use it. Alchester shrugged. He didn't look like he was lying. Well, everyone around Alchester would have noticed it if he could really use dragon fear. I think we talked enough about dragon fear, so I would like to talk about why I called you here. Alchester cleared his throat again and straightened his posture. The Lionheart's white flame formula and red flame formula are very popular, but I'm aware of how it is forbidden to teach those formulas to outsiders. Yes, that's correct. Eugene nodded. Of course, I am not expecting you to teach Leo the white flame formula and the red flame formula. Although I wish you could teach Leo your swordsmanship, which you have shown before, it would be too difficult for Leo to learn that right now. I will try. No, what I'm trying to say is that you don't have to try too hard in teaching Leo. Like I said, I just want you to be Leo's, and the Dragonic's friend for a long time. But I have to teach him something, right? Trick. Alchester grinned as he spoke of one word. I want you to teach my son about your trick in controlling mana. Alchester's request made Eugene see him in a different light. Just like Carmen had said, Alchester may be a timid and well-mannered man, but he was indeed insightful enough to be called the best knight of the Empire. There would be so many examples of tricks, such as the best method to distribute the person's mana to create sword energy, the method to unite mana to transform sword energy into sword force, the best method to circulate mana through the person's core, or the first pathway in the person's body that was supposed to be used while infusing mana. Leo was a genius in controlling mana. Other people would also consider Eugene a genius in mana control. Leo and Eugene had similar talent, but Eugene had mastered mana control, so Alchester wanted Eugene's trick. It's not difficult to teach my trick. I'm not asking you to teach it for free, Alchester said as he grabbed the sword on his waist. In return, I'll teach you the Dragonic style. I was Alchester's martial art teacher. I didn't prefer a sword or a spear since I was a child, so I taught him hand-to-hand combat. In return, the Dragonic Patriarch at the time taught me the clan's martial arts. It didn't help me much. Eugene bowed as he recalled what Carmen had said. I look forward to our sparring. Alchester's lesson hadn't begun, but Eugene felt like he was already suffering a loss. Until Alchester pulled out his sword. 1. The part about the dark dragon is a meme in Korea. Used to mock someone who is a Chuyuni, but Carmen was genuine when she asked the question. Chapter 176. Aria 1. Alchester slowly drew his sword. His stance hadn't changed much, but Eugene felt a completely different sense of presence coming from Alchester. Right now, in Eugene's eyes, Alchester's fighting spirit didn't seem to have been aroused, but the usual sense of foppishness couldn't be felt at all. Instead, there was an extreme sharpness. Even in his previous life, it was rare for Eugene to have seen someone whose entire sense of presence resonated so closely with their sword. If it's in terms of sharpness alone, then he's even better than Gilead, Eugene judged. In terms of swords, such changes in presence should only correspond to a swordman's inner nature. That was why Alchester's sharpness came as even more of a surprise. The Great Vermouth was able to wield such a wide range of weapons and magic that he was even called the Master of all, but Oryx Dragonic only ever used a single sword. As he stared down at his drawn sword, Alchester continued, in the following 300 years, the Dragonic family has continued to develop the swordsmanship left by our founding ancestor. Even though I am a distant descendant, I'm fully aware of the serious hardships my ancestors were forced to bear while doing so. What hardships are you talking about? Eugene asked curiously. Sir Oryx Dragonic had the strength of a half-human half-dragon, but his strength wasn't passed on to the future generations, Alcester said regretfully as he shook his head with a bitter smile. It said that Sir Oryx could emit a sword force as tall as a mountain peak and as wide as a castle wall, but it was impossible for the later generations to do the same. My ancestors and even I didn't have a huge reserve of mana like Sir Oryx did, nor did we share the same aptitude with mana that all half-human half-dragons have. That was only natural. After all, Oryx wasn't a real half-human half-dragon, and he had gained his strength by consuming a dragon heart all by himself. Eugene had also once shared a dragon heart with his companions in his previous life, so he was well aware of how much mana was contained in a single dragon heart. However, my ancestors didn't give up, Alcester declared proudly as he extended his sword. Whoosh! The blue light of his sword force wrapped around the blade. There wasn't anything special up to that point, but the change that occurred after this caused even Eugene to feel surprised. The sword force had suddenly swollen significantly. After examining Alcester's sword force without saying a word, Eugene nodded with an exclamation. He had figured out the method used to perform such a technique. The sword force that Alcester had emitted just now could be said to have reached the pinnacle of efficiency. He had emitted his sword force with the minimum amount of mana required, then combined the mana in the air into his sword force. By doing so, it was possible to amplify the strength of his sword force by infusing more mana. However, this technique wasn't necessarily without its disadvantages. Using mana that hadn't been processed by his core resulted in a corresponding loss in Alcester's control over the power and density of his sword force. In other words, this sword force wasn't actually as powerful as it looked. At this moment, if Eugene pulled out his own sword force, which was generated through the white flame formula, and clashed with Alcester's giant sword force, Eugene would be able to destroy it with just a few collisions. It's not as impressive as it looks, Alcester muttered as he waved the sword around. That's why it ended up being named the Empty Sword. The biggest problem with the Empty Sword is its sustainability and durability are far too poor. It also can't be used properly in places with low levels of mana, and the longer you activate the technique, the weaker it gets. I see, Eugene said with a nod. My ancestors tried various methods to reduce this technique's shortcomings, and they managed to succeed to some extent, Alcester said. How so? Eugene asked, feeling intrigued. Being good at mana manipulation in his previous life, Eugene had also tried to develop various methods to extract the maximum amount of power from the little mana he had. By doing so, he had managed to create the method of ignition, which deliberately overloaded the core in exchange for power. Ignition still proved useful even now that he had managed to accumulate a much larger amount of mana through the cores formed from the white flame formula. Instead, it's actually even better than when I used it in my previous life. Whether in terms of the body or the core's performance, the conditions provided by the white flame formula were overwhelmingly better than those Eugene had enjoyed in his previous life. So the stability and output of ignition when used with the white flame formula had increased significantly. In Eugene's opinion, it seemed like this empty sword could also be useful when applied with the white flame formula. Like this, Alcester said as he drew on his mana once more. Another layer of mana was added on top of his unstable sword force. The sword force and this new layer of mana did not mix. Instead, the mana just covered the surface of the sword force thinly. This layer of mana then slowly tightened, condensing the unstable sword force. Once done, another layer of sword force was added to the surface. The whole process was then repeated. Eugene felt a sense of pure admiration. Alcester was adding layers of mana and sword force alternatingly on top of the actual blade, like adding coats of paint. It's quite the difficult process, Eugene muttered with a nod of amazement. What Alcester was doing was extremely difficult. By repeatedly coating the sword, the power of the sword force was amplified and stabilized, but this process of coating required an incredibly high ability in mana manipulation. It gets harder the more layers you add to it, Alcester said as he stared at his sword. The sword force had now taken on a deep dark blue color. The shape of the actual blade was no longer even visible. Even for me, stacking 8 layers is my limit, Alcester admitted. I first succeeded in stacking a layer when I was 21 years old. That was the age at which Alcester had participated and won the Imperial Martial Arts Tournament. Ulster smiled and dissipated his empty sword. The condensed mana flowed back into the air. You'll probably do even better than me. When I was still your age. Alcester paused in recollection. I was so much weaker that I couldn't even begin to compare with you. Isn't the empty sword the Dragonic family's special technique? Is it really all right for you to teach it to a member of the Lionheart clan? Eugene asked hesitantly. The Dragonic's martial heritage isn't limited to just the empty sword, Alcester proudly declared as he returned his sword to its scabbard. As the head of the family, it's my honor to offer one of the Dragonic's martial techniques to you, who'll soon become the future center of the Lionheart clan. Of course, that's only if you want to learn it, that is. Is there any reason for me to refuse such an offer? Eugene asked with a smirk. After he had been reincarnated and learned the white flame formula, he had never once felt a shortage of mana. Except for when using the Moonlight Sword, that savage blade, that is. Now that the eternal hole had been grafted on with the ring flame formula, the power of his cores had been amplified to their limit. What if the empty sword was added on top of that? That meant there wouldn't be any mana depletion even if he continued to emit his sword force for days. Being able to superimpose his sword force like that would also be an interesting trick. A week had passed since Eugene had first arrived at the Dragonic mansion. During the mornings and afternoons he taught Leo, and in the evenings, Alcester guided him in using the empty sword at the Dragonic family's training ground. This is insane, Alcester thought to himself, unable to hide his astonishment. Currently Eugene's sword was wrapped up in some grayish-white flames. This wasn't a sword force made purely from the white flame formula. With the technique of the empty sword, the mana in the air was drawn in as fuel for the sword force, then another layer of sword force was added to its surface. At first this caused the sword force to look like a dark ray of light, but little by little the color of the sword force was lightening up. This is because the white flame formula, which burnt high outputs of mana, was burning the impurities out of the unrefined mana. This should allow me to form an empty sword without compromising the power of the white flame formula, Eugene thought to himself in satisfaction. Even if he had already accumulated a strong foundation to work on in the past, to think that Eugene would actually succeed in forming the empty sword in just 1 week. After seeing this with his own eyes, Alcester felt like part of his common sense was collapsing. If you were a woman, I would have used everything in my ability to get you engaged to Leo, Alcester confessed wistfully. Don't say something so disgusting, Eugene said with a shudder as he stared down at his empty sword. It was hard to get the balance just right. If he reduced the output of the white flame formula, then the power would decrease, but if he maintained the high output, then the stability would fall. No matter how much mastery of mana manipulation Eugene had carried over from his previous life, he couldn't get used to performing such a difficult skill right away. This kind of skill required a tremendous level of practice in addition to the sensitivity and talent needed to even start practicing it. For now, this balance is the best I can maintain, Eugene admitted. If that's the case, then how about stacking it? Eugene connected his cores through the ring flame formula, and the 5 stars rotated together, amplifying his mana. Fwoosh. His empty sword shook strongly. It's collapsy. No, it hasn't collapsed yet. I need to immediately adapt to the increase in mana and adjust it, Eugene reminded himself. The amount of mana he had first added to the flames had been random. However, Eugene immediately began to reassess and adjust the amounts. With this, he was able to add another layer to the empty sword. At 2 stacks, the grayish-white flame burned with even more intensity, then gradually began to burn with a blue light. Crack crack. A sound like space itself being crushed began to echo throughout the training ground. Alcester looked around in bewilderment. All the mana in the training ground was being sucked into Eugene's flame. Is this really just 2 stacks? Alcester thought in disbelief. Slowly, even lightning began to mix into those increasingly fierce flames. Cold sweat started to drip down Eugene's forehead, but his eyes unwaveringly focused on his mana. Mare also stuck her head out from within the cloak to stare at the flames. Black spots began to appear on the flames. Poh! The empty sword scattered into thin air. Eugene let out a deep breath and lowered the sword. No, that thing couldn't be called a sword any longer. Cracks had spread throughout the blade, and it shattered the moment it was lowered. Ha ha ha. Alcester let out an incredulous laugh and shook his head. He had sensed an unbelievable amount of power coming from it, even though it only held 2 stacks. The layering failed only because the power was too great. That empty sword had contained a pure power that went beyond the limits of the technique. That was why Alcester couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. Among all the great warriors who had made a name for themselves throughout the continent, how many of them would be able to receive a direct attack from that sword? Phew, Eugene let out a deep sigh and let go of the broken sword hilt. His fingers were trembling slightly. Not much of the mana from his cores had been used. The recoil when the empty sword had dissipated wasn't all that great either. But his fingers were still trembling because of the pure bliss that he was feeling. I reached it, Eugene silently rejoiced. It wasn't an illusion. The moment when black dots had been mixed into his empty sword, the power that Eugene had held in his hands barely reached the heights that Hamel had held in his heyday. This brought Eugene great joy. He thought he'd be reaching the 6th star of the White Flame formula soon, but for the moment, Eugene was still stuck at the 5th star of the White Flame formula. Even so, he had managed to hold in his hands the same level of power he had once held in his prime. So what if he hadn't managed to control it properly? He might not be able to control that level of power now, but he would be able to control it in the future. As long as he could improve his proficiency in the technique through hard work, he just needed to keep training until he could easily use the complete version of the technique. If I lower my standards in terms of the balance, I can increase the number of layers. However, the power won't be as explosively amplified as before. For now, this is the optimal configuration, and I have no choice but to further adjust the details as things progress. Eugene gathered his thoughts and raised his head. Alcester still had a look of admiration on his face. Eugene had yet to find any clues regarding the dragon, but he had already reaped an excellent reward for coming to the Dragonic family just by acquiring this empty sword. "Thank you very much," Eugene said sincerely. The black spots he had seen earlier, their intense color, remained stubbornly stuck inside Alcester's mind. Instead of feeling jealous and resentful of this young genius in front of him, Alcester was wondering whether he could apply what Eugene had shown him to his own swordsmanship. How amazing! Even though I've been practicing the empty sword for decades, to think that my eyes would be opened to its further possibilities, Alcester marveled. That was why Alcester couldn't help but feel that it was all the more bizarre. The level of skill that Eugene had just shown was so high that it seemed impossible for him to have reached such heights at the mere age of 20, even considering the fact that he was a genius. Alcester felt like he could sense the skills of a warrior who had trained for decades coming from Eugene. "I'm the one who should be grateful instead," Alcester belatedly responded with a smile and a bow of his head. "Thanks to you, I feel like I can still learn something new at my late age." Alcester had thought that he had been close to the limit of what could be reached, but it turned out that was just an absurd and delusional arrogance on his part. Without erasing the smile drawn on his face, Alcester continued speaking. "It seems that there's no longer any need for me to supervise your sword practice." "You're overpraising me," Eugene humbly denied. "No. I seriously mean it. In the first place, your sword, it's already so perfect that I don't know what to advise you on. The only advice I could give you was tips on how to practice the empty sword," Alcester readily admitted. At first he had thought that he would be able to at least spend a month giving Eugene just such advice, but Eugene had become so proficient in the empty sword that he didn't need any advice in only 2 days. And now, after a week, Eugene was already able to reach up to the 2nd stack all on his own. "I've heard a lot about you from Leo as well. Leo seems to enjoy your tutoring a lot," Alcester remarked happily. "It's all thanks to the fact that Leo listens well," Eugene prevaricated. After disciplining that brat in their first meeting, Eugene had guided Leo in his mana training. Since his talent was outstanding, Leo quickly understood Eugene's instructions. Although it was impossible at the moment, in a year or so, Eugene expected Leo to be able to develop his own sword light. "I have nothing more to teach you, so I'd feel guilty to keep you in our mansion any longer. You may return to the Lionheart clan whenever you wish," Alcester said, feeling that this was the right thing to do. After his son had learned the basics of mana from Eugene, starting 4 days ago, the two had begun holding lessons outside, with Eugene also guiding Leo into learning martial arts. At first, the knights sworn to the household had been dissatisfied with their one and only young master being taught by a member of the Lionheart clan, but after seeing Eugene tutor Leo, they no longer expressed such dissatisfaction. Although he was just tutoring a child, they couldn't help but acknowledge the physical capabilities that Eugene had revealed. No matter how many rumors they might have heard about Eugene, It was much quicker for them to understand what kind of person he was by looking at him with their own eyes instead of just hearing about him. Given his youth, Leo had a lot to learn, but Alcester had nothing more to teach Eugene. It was impossible to teach Eugene any of their other secret skills, apart from the empty sword, and it was also impossible to lecture this child on his basic skills when his basic skills were just as polished as Alcester's. "If you say so, then I will leave tomorrow," Eugene said after bowing his head. He left the training ground. It was late at night and the air was cool, perfect weather for a walk. Eugene went straight across the garden to the mansion without tossing a backward look at the training ground. "You're leaving? But you haven't discovered anything specific yet, have you?" Mare asked with a puzzled expression. Only for Eugene to reply with a grin, "There are a few things that have caught my eye." During the week spent at the Dragonic mansion, Eugene had reduced his sleeping time to look around the mansion in the early mornings. He avoided the eyes of the many servants and knights and didn't even step close to the floor Alcester was on. That said, he hadn't neglected to explore that floor. He had just done so in daylight when he was relatively free to act. He had devoted himself to his search while pretending to be looking at the art displayed on the top floor. But he hadn't found any traces of the dragon. There weren't even any special locations in this mansion like the Lionheart Estate's ley line. After struggling to find anything, Eugene decided to rethink the matter from the beginning. Back to the dragon fear, Eugene recalled. If a 10-year-old child was capable of unconsciously exuding dragon fear, there was no way that it would have gone unnoticed. But when he had used a perception spell, he hadn't been able to look inside Leo's body. It wasn't because of the magic resistance in Leo's body that his spell had failed to see through Leo. If Leo had that much magic resistance in the first place, then Eugene wouldn't have been able to force the stream of water that Leo had shot at him back into the kid's own mouth and nose. When Eugene first felt the dragon fear, he had been casting a detection spell while holding Leo's wrist. So Eugene thought that Leo had unconsciously resisted his magic and exuded the dragon fear in response. But that wasn't the case now, was it? The dragon fear was just a simple warning from somewhere else. But a warning against what? After organizing all the things that he had learned in the past week inside of his head, Eugene stopped walking. He was in front of Leo's room. The door was locked. There weren't any traces of people in his surroundings. From the moment Eugene entered the mansion, he had cast an invisibility spell and hid his presence as much as possible. Eugene placed his hand on the doorknob and immediately cast a spell. The door opened without a sound. Eugene slipped into the room. He saw Leo sleeping on top of his large bed, dead to the world. Eugene dispelled the invisibility spell and approached Leo. He cast another detection spell. It still didn't work. Eugene kept up the spell as he looked around the room. There was nothing special. Eugene checked on Leo, then placed a hand inside his cloak. Eugene pulled out a small dagger and held it close to Leo's neck. He didn't release any killing intent. However, his actions showed no signs of hesitation. The moment his sharp blade touched Leo's neck, however, whoosh, the same dragon fear as last time attacked Eugene. "Sir Eugene," Mare called out. Eugene didn't freeze, immediately springing into action. Where had it come from? The feeling was fleeting and light, but now that he was aware, he had enough time to figure out the truth. Eugene's eyes quickly scanned the room. His eyes landed on the closed windows. Crackle. Lightning flashed up from his feet, and Eugene's body accelerated explosively. "Huh." Leo woke up, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "I thought I heard something just now?" But there was no one inside his room. Caught up in a floating sensation with his feet being lifted off the ground, Eugene felt like it was being stretched out and then quickly pulled somewhere else. A warp. The floating sensation ended in an instant. The ground suddenly reappeared, but Eugene landed on his own feet without any unsteadiness. Then, without any loss of composure, he lifted his head. A dangerous feeling pressed down on his whole body. As if to tear his entire existence into pieces, a wave of violent dragon fear poured at him from the front. Eugene felt like every hair on his body was standing on end, but even as this feeling of intimidation washed over him, his shoulders remained upright. "Just who are you?" a voice demanded. In front of a fireplace, a woman with red hair that was even brighter than the flames of the log fire was glaring at Eugene. She seemed to have been reading until just recently, as she was sitting in an armchair with a thick book resting on her lap. "I'm Eugene Lionheart," Eugene replied without avoiding her gaze. Are dragons these days all so voyeuristic? Eugene slowly turned his head and looked behind him. An entire wall on one side was made of glass, and like a piece of stained glass, it was divided into dozens of different screens that each reflected a different scene. Among these screens were some showing Leo's room, the hallways of the mansion, the garden, and even the training field. How did you find out? The dragon spoke up once more. You shouldn't have been able to find the door with your magic. I changed the entire draconic incantation so that you wouldn't be able to peek at it with your irritating detection spell. But you didn't do that on your first day, did you? Eugene asked. How could I have known that Akasha's owner would come to visit and cast a detection spell? The dragon muttered with a click of her tongue. As expected, the dragon fear that Eugene had first sensed from Leo wasn't because Leo himself was resisting the detection spell. The dragon who was watching through the glass window had sent him a warning, fearing that her peeping would be exposed by the detection spell. She hadn't sent a warning again after that because she had changed her draconic incantations to evade Eugene's detection magic. I know that there's no actual dragon blood mixed into the blood of the dragonic family, Eugene spoke up without any concern on his face. Also, I've actually experienced dragon fear personally. When you first sent the dragon fear as a warning, I was convinced that a dragon was here. You say that you felt dragon fear before, the dragon muttered as the dragon fear that had been oppressing his whole body disappeared. The dragon tilted her head slightly to the side as she blatantly stared at Eugene's face before eventually saying, Eugene Lionheart, a descendant of the Lionheart clan. Did you hear about me from Carmen Lionheart? No, Eugene denied. As it should be, the dragon nodded. Her meeting with me was accidental and she even swore an oath in Draconic. It seemed that even this dragon hadn't suspected that Carmen would get the urge to show off whenever a mention of the word dragon came up. If you know about dragon fear, that means you must have met a dragon. But I can't believe that. There's no way that you, Eugene Lionheart, could have met a dragon, the dragon insisted. I have no reason to lie to you, Eugene argued. I met a dragon. No. You definitely have never met a dragon, the dragon interrupted, narrowing her eyes. My name is Ariartel, a member of the Red Dragon Flight and the only dragon to still keep her eyes open. Since I have never met you before, when you claim to have met a dragon, it must be a Lee. This time it was Eugene's turn to interrupt. I am Hamel. Ariartel froze with her mouth open. Chapter 177. It was as if time had just stopped. Ertel froze with her mouth wide open. Then, after belatedly closing her mouth, she began to silently consider Eugene's words. Hamel. Although it was unexpected for this name to have come up, Ariartel was immediately able to recall whose name it was. The stupid Hamel? Ariartel said hesitantly. Eugene sighed. Why not just leave out the stupid part? Eugene Lionheart, you, a descendant of Vermouth Lionheart, are claiming that you're the stupid Hamel? I told you to leave out the stupid part. Human, are you seriously trying to make fun of me? Ariartel demanded as she stared at Eugene with slightly furrowed eyes. Although she didn't release any of that ruthless dragon fear, even without that, Eugene could clearly tell that Ariartel was highly displeased. After wondering what he could do to make her believe him, Eugene thought of a simple method. He immediately stuck his hand inside his cloak. Ariartel was slightly startled by this sudden move, but she soon resumed watching Eugene with a calm gaze. Eugene couldn't retrieve his hand from inside his cloak right away. This was because Mare had grabbed onto his hand. She was curled up into a ball and trembling inside the cloak. Eugene frowned as he felt Mare's trembling conveyed through her grip on his hand. But instead of frowning because of Mare's resistance, Eugene glared at Ariartel, who was responsible for attacking them with her dragon fear in the first place. Hey, she's terrified because of you, Eugene complained. What? Ariartel asked in a puzzled tone, but instead of answering, Eugene just stroked Mare's head with his hand that was inside the cloak. However, her trembling refused to abate. Dragon fear was spread by scattering mana. Thus, as a familiar, Mare was more sensitive to dragon fear than a human, especially because she had a sense of self-awareness that allowed her to be scared of being destroyed. Eventually, Eugene managed to pull Mare out of the cloak. I'm perfectly fine, Mare insisted in a shaky voice, even though her body continued to tremble. All right, Eugene mumbled in comfort as he hugged Mare with one arm. Mare sniffed as she buried her face into Eugene's chest and handed over with which she had carried out of the cloak with her. "I'm not here because I'm afraid," Mare claimed. "Since you are looking for WNYD, I decided to bring it to you myself, Sir Eugene." All right, Eugene continued to murmur in comfort. "Since I'd be bored staying in the cloak on my own, I've decided to stay with you, Sir Eugene, for now." All right. Just what in the world were they doing? Ariartel narrowed her eyes as she scanned Mare. Although she looked no different from a human being, this was definitely a familiar that had been created through highly advanced magic. Even for Ariartel, it would be impossible to create a familiar with such a high level of realism. For him to hold that familiar in his arms like she was a child, Ariartel thought curiously. "Do you have a problem with keeping your eyes wide open?" Eugene asked suddenly. "Are you talking to me?" Ariartel demanded as her cheeks twitched in irritation. Instead of replying, Eugene drew WNYD. The wind immediately enveloped the silver-blue blade. Soon the wind spirit king Tempest arrived in response to Eugene's summons. It appeared as if he already understood the situation, as Tempest appeared in front of Eugene in the form of a small whirlwind rather than his usual full-scale storm. The wind spirit king, Ariartel recognized Tempest. After looking back and forth between Tempest and Eugene, she tilted her head to the side and asked, "You surely haven't summoned the Spirit King with the intention of fighting me, have you?" "Tempest, tell her about the fact that I'm Hamel," Eugene ordered. Eugene had no intention of doing something like fighting Ariartel, a dragon, head-on. He just summoned Tempest because he needed a guarantor. Young dragon. He really is Hamel Dynas, the one who made a name for himself 300 years ago. And in the current era he is known as the stupid Hamel. Ariartel listened silently. "I understand your disbelief, but I, Tempest, guarantee that Eugene Lionheart is the reincarnation of Hamel. As you should know, a spirit king like me wouldn't lie to you like this." "Did you just say reincarnation?" Ariartel muttered with a blank expression. Even though it had been personally guaranteed by a spirit king, she stared blankly into Eugene's face, unable to believe it. A hero from 300 years ago had been reincarnated into the present age. And as a descendant of a fellow hero at that, reincarnation of the soul was nothing special. All beings died someday and were reincarnated into other beings. However, being reincarnated with their memories of their past life intact was, in Ariartel's opinion, something impossible to be a coincidence. If that was the case, then had someone planned his reincarnation? Was that something even possible to do with magic? "I'll believe you for now," Ariartel conceded, nodding slowly. She had some serious suspicions about Eugene's reincarnation, but at the same time she felt curious about why Eugene had come looking for her here. "If you really are Hamel, then you would, of course, be aware that the founder of the Dragonic family wasn't a half-man half-dragon. Since you were living in the same era as him," Ariartel concluded. "So why is a dragon watching over the Dragonic family?" Eugene asked as he turned his head to look behind him. He might not know where exactly this place was, but it was clear that Ariartel had been watching over the Dragonic family for quite some time. "You could consider it a form of entertainment," Ariartel replied with a wave of her hand. At this gesture, all the screens that filled the wall were turned off simultaneously. Ariartel continued, "Palaske, the dragon that the founder of the family, Oryx Dragonic, claimed as his own father, was actually my father. Oryx absorbed my father's dragon heart and then lied to the world, claiming that Palaske was his father and that he was a half-human half-dragon. If you consider that an insult to your father, have you thought of trying to erase the Dragonic family?" Eugene brought up carefully. "No, I don't really consider that an insult," Ariartel denied. "My father died while I was still just an egg, and dragons do not feel much affection for their parents in the first place." Tempest had referred to Ariartel as a young dragon. Eugene didn't know how long a dragon's lifespan was nor how old they needed to be still be called young. "How old are you?" Eugene decided to ask openly. After consideration, Ariartel eventually decided to answer him, "I'm over 200 years. "So you're younger than me," Eugene interrupted her triumphantly. Tempest turned his head to look at Eugene with a confused expression, and even Mare, whose face was still buried in Eugene's chest, raised her head to stare at him. Ariartel appeared just as confused. Her eyes widened into circles as she looked at Eugene, and she tilted her head to the side in question. Eugene changed the subject, While I'm not sure about the first time you shot your dragon fear at me, just earlier you shot your dragon fear at me because you thought that I was about to kill Leo, right? To me, that doesn't seem like you're simply watching them for your own entertainment. Wouldn't it be strange for me to just let him die while I'm watching? Ariartel said defensively. Eugene let out a snort at this off-balance answer as he continued to rub Mare's back. The truth is that I'm not really interested in your reasons for doing so, Eugene admitted. It doesn't matter to me whether I know or not. While Eugene wasn't even able to guess what a dragon's version of family affection might look like, seeing how she was looking over them like this, it was clear that Ariartel had some form of attachment to the Dragonic family. However, that was none of Eugene's business. Although he may have developed some feelings of respect for Alcester after being taught the empty sword, the bond between Ariartel and the Dragonic family seemed several times deeper and more personal than the bond between Eugene and Alcester. So rather than a mystery like that, Eugene was more concerned with something that Ariartel had said earlier. Did you say that you're the only dragon whose eyes are still open in the present era? Eugene asked in confirmation. 300 years ago, the dragons fought a battle with the Demon King of Incarceration and the Demon King of Destruction. The Demon King of Incarceration withdrew from the front line after killing 5 or 6 dragons, while the Demon King of Destruction slaughtered half of all the dragons. During that battle, Raizakia betrayed his fellow dragons. He killed the Lord of all Dragons who had been leading them from the front with a surprise attack from behind, took the Lord's dragon heart and then fled from the front lines. Stupid Hamel, you should also be aware of what kind of battle the dragons fought 300 years ago. In that battle with the Demon King of Destruction, barely half of the dragons managed to survive, but the ones who did weren't unharmed, Ariartel said in grave tones. In Helmuth they had met a dragon who was on the brink of death. Dragons whose deaths are imminent will devise methods to make their remaining lifespan worthwhile, Ariartel continued. Eugene listened in silence. Ariartel explained, a deceased dragon will leave no trace of their presence in this world. Their bones, scales, blood and heart, everything will just return back to mana. Some of the dying dragons decided that they wanted to leave their hearts behind, and my father, Palaske, was one of them. Palaske created a dungeon as a test of ability and sealed his own dragon heart at the end. He hoped that an outstanding adventurer who had managed to break through his dungeon would absorb his dragon heart and continue to play an active role in saving this terrible world. Although he wasn't that outstanding, Oryx Dragonic did manage to break through the dungeon as Palaske had hoped and laid his hands on the dragon heart. In his previous life, Hamel and his comrades managed to get their hands on a dragon heart through similar means. The dragons whose deaths were unavoidable disappeared from the world like this, while the dragons who were in slightly better states devoted themselves to caring for their own wounds. However, the war ended before the dragons could recover and return to the battlefield, Ariartel revealed. The Great Vermouth managed to wring out an oath with the Demon King of Incarceration. I don't know what the contents of that oath were, Ariartel confessed. However, after the oath was sworn, the dragons all decided to go into hibernation at the same time. I, who was just a newborn hatchling at that time, was charged with the duty of managing the cradle, and remained alone in this world all on my own. At the mention of the oath, Eugene shot a glance at Tempest. However, Tempest didn't show any sort of reaction to this. Tempest had probably been aware that the dragons had gone into hibernation, but it seemed that he wasn't in a position to reveal this without permission. Wouldn't it have been possible for them to heal their wounds without going to sleep? Eugene asked in uncertainty. I don't know why all the other dragons went into hibernation simultaneously either. That should be a satisfactory explanation for your question. So, stupid Hamel, just what business has brought you to come looking for a dragon? Ariartel asked while at the same time making a display of her full power. Although it was certainly interesting that the one in front of her was the reincarnation of a hero from 300 years ago, there wasn't any reason for Ariartel to bow her head in front of him. I want to borrow your strength, Eugene revealed without any hesitation. At these words, Ariartel let out a snort as if she had been expecting him to say something like that and shook her head. How regrettable, stupid Hamel, you seem to want to borrow my power to bring an end to the Demon King's subjugation that you weren't able to fully achieve 300 years ago, but unfortunately I am not in a position where I can become greatly involved in the affairs of the world. What are you talking about? Eugene interjected. How could you expect me to join forces with a dragon who's only a little over 200 years old to defeat the demon kings? If so, just what in the world have you come looking for? Ariartel demanded. I need your draconic magic, Eugene revealed. Ariartel's brow furrowed as she tilted her head to the other side and asked, just what exactly is it that you want? I need a spell that searches for a gap between dimensions, Eugene explained as he dragged over a nearby chair without asking for permission and sat down in front of Ariartel. I don't know the exact coordinates of the gap and I don't even know which dimension it's next to. What I do know is that it can't be in a dimension too far from our own. I'm also a wizard, so speaking from my perspective, I feel that the gap is probably somewhere that straddles our own dimension. Ariartel was speechless. The spell, a forced expulsion to an outer dimension, was cast in an incomplete form, so the subject was only thrown into a gap between the dimensions, Eugene informed her. Even so, their link to this world has not been severed. It seems that their contract with their subordinates is still being supported in a limited fashion. Hold on. Just hold on a moment. Ariartel raised her hands and interrupted Eugene, unable to hide how flustered she was. A forced expulsion to an outer dimension? So it's a spell meant to banish a target to an outer dimension through magic. Aha, Eugene confirmed. That's absurd. There's no way that such a spell exists. Forcibly banishing an existence is impossible, even with a draconic incantation spell. Just who in the world would? Sienna Meridian. The name that Eugene spat out caused Mare to prick up her ears. If she had her way, she would have shrugged in disdain and even puffed her chest a little to show off. But Mare was still in a state of fear because of the dragon fear that Ariartel had emitted. The wise Sienna, Ariartel muttered in realization. Whether or not such a spell actually exists is none of my business. Sienna cast it and what I said did happen, Eugene stated confidently. Just what in the world would be able to survive going through a dimensional rift? Ariartel asked in shock. The black dragon Rhizachia, Eugene finally revealed. The moment that name passed his lips, Ariartel shot up out of her seat. Her red hair shook like a wave of flames, and her eyes were filled with strong murderous intent. She even began to ruthlessly emit her dragon fear. While hugging the trembling Mare with an even tighter grip, Eugene glared at Ariartel. He cursed, "Fuck, I told you not to do that." Ariartel roared, "Rhizachia. The black dragon. You're talking about the dragon demon castle's Rhizachia? Stupid Hamel. Are you actually trying to save Rhizachia from a gap between dimensions?" Did she have to keep using that foolish name and call him the stupid Hamel? There was no way that she could possibly think that calling him by that title was showing off her draconic dignity, was there? Eugene snorted. Why would I want to save him? I want to find him to finish him off, but it would be a bit difficult to find him with just my abilities. That's why I need your help. You want to kill that Rhizachia with your own hands. Stupid Hamel, I know you were a hero in the past, but you can't kill Rhizachia with your current strength. Ariartel chastised. I'll take care of that on my own, so, for now calm down, retract your dragon fear and take a seat, Eugene calmly instructed. And stop calling me stupid. I will help you. Rhizachia is a traitor to all dragons. His misdeeds must end at the hands of us dragons. Wait, no, Ariartel trailed off, her eyes widening hugely. She covered her head with both hands, groaned, then sat down with a sigh. Do I really? No, there's no way. I already have a different mission. No, stop. I've never even asked you to fight alongside me, so why are you making a fuss all by yourself? I just need you to tell me the method to find the gap between dimensions where Rhizachia is trapped, Eugene reminded her. Such a spell doesn't exist, Ariartel said thoughtfully as she tapped her temple. A dimensional gap. If the contract between the master and his subordinates is still intact, that means that his connection with the world hasn't been fully severed. However, if such a contract is under the full control of the master, and the contractors cannot go against it or even interfere with it, then... Ariartel muttered to herself for quite some time. Eugene left Ariartel alone while she was occupied with this and turned to look around the room. Eugene still didn't know where this place was exactly. He first decided to approach a window and look outside, only to see the scenery of a secluded rural village. This place seems to be in Kiel. But where exactly? Eugene thought curiously. For now, all he knew was that this house wasn't a mansion for nobles or wealthy merchants. It was just a small, ordinary house that you could find in any village. And apart from Ariartel, it didn't seem like anyone else was living here. Strengthening a tracking spell, to be able to find its targets beyond this space and in another dimension. No. Once you leave the spatial area and go into the gap between dimensions, things like boundaries and coordinates are meaningless. If we just want to get a rough heading. That's right, Ariartel muttered to herself for quite some time before lifting her head. Let's cooperate. How would you like to do that? Eugene asked. I'll place the draconic magic needed to track down Rhyzakia in an artifact. However, it's impossible to find Rhyzakia with just this. We need something connected to Rhyzakia, Ariartel informed him. Connected. Eugene repeated. Something like an item that Rhyzakia has carried with him for a long time. The longer an item has been carried with him, the more of his spiritual energy it should have absorbed, and such spiritual energy is bound to have the disposition of its owner engraved in it, Ariartel explained. An item, you say? What about blood? Eugene asked, his eyes brightening. Blood? When Ariartel asked him to elaborate, Eugene informed her about the possibility that the Rhyzakia who was currently ruling over the Dragon Demon Castle couldn't be Rhyzakia himself and might just be his hatchling. Unlike with a contractor, such blood ties are of equal restraint to both parties. If it really is Rhyzakia's hatchling, then we might just be able to find Rhyzakia through him, Ariartel confirmed optimistically. Having heard all this, Eugene pulled Akasha out of a pocket. Ariartel's eyes shook as she saw the red jewel glowing at the tip of the staff. This was a staff that had been created using a dragon heart and the branches of the world tree. Ariartel gulped, mesmerized by the power of the staff. What are you doing? Ariartel asked once she collected her composure. Wouldn't such a draconic spell work well when engraved into Akasha? The effect should be amplified as well, Eugene guessed. That might be the case, but I won't be able to carve such a spell into it right now, Ariartel informed him. Then I'll just leave it with you for now, Eugene replied to her calmly and handed Akasha over to Ariartel. Can I come back to pick it up in a week's time? That much time should be enough, Ariartel agreed. Eugene's attitude confused Ariartel. Even though she was a dragon, this human wasn't showing her the respect a dragon deserved. Instead, it felt like he was entrusting this item to her like she was some common blacksmith or a seamstress. By the way, you and Lady Carmen, why did you make that heaven genocide for her? Eugene asked curiously. What is heaven genocide? Ariartel asked in confusion. Was she just pretending not to know? With some embarrassment, Eugene explained, it's that thing. The thing that usually looks like a pocket watch, but if you shout form change, it goes through a strange transformation. Are you talking about the alchemy gloves? Ariartel murmured. It was all because of an accidental meeting. Decades ago, Ariartel had been doing what she did every day, enjoying her leisure time while watching the scenes of the Dragonic Mansion play out across her viewing wall. She was interested in the lady from the Lionheart clan who had arrived at the mansion a few days ago. Although her personality was a bit bizarre, Ariartel admired her good looks and martial arts skills. Alchester had been 5 years old at the time, but unlike his father who didn't have any talent, Alchester was extremely precocious. If that child were to become the next patriarch, then the Dragonic family would enjoy greater power than ever before. Then what if they managed to arrange a betrothal to the lady of the Lionheart clan on top of that? A dragon's daily life is quite boring. So dragons soothe the boredom of their life through various amusements. It's for the same reasons that I watch over the Dragonic family. Watching these humans live their short lives with such passion and even tracking the progress of a family is quite an immersive pastime even for a dragon. It could be said to be similar to how humans watch creative performances such as operas and plays, Ariartel explained. Contrary to what Ariartel had hoped for, Carmen didn't feel any affection towards Alchester. That was the same for Alchester. In the first place, Carmen was 17 years old back then while Alchester was only 5. Although there hadn't been any progress in terms of a relationship, Ariartel never lost interest in watching Carmen Lionheart. This was because Carmen was more bizarre than any human that Ariartel had seen thus far. Carmen Lionheart was a fascinating human. When she was alone in her room, she once drew a strange magic circle on the floor and attempted to cast a spell all on her own. It was just a scribble without any magical influences, and the spell she cast was... Ariartel hesitated. Eugene groaned. I don't think I really want to know what she said. I don't really want to say it either, Ariartel agreed. Ariartel grew sloppy. She couldn't help but think of it that way. Carmen was so much fun to watch that she ended up watching over Carmen far too closely. No. More than that, it happened because Ariartel could have never imagined that Carmen would behave like that. One day, after Carmen Lionheart had returned from her training and finished washing up, she became enamored with her reflection in the mirror. Ariartel began. What? Eugene barked in confusion. Don't humans sometimes behave like that? Ariartel asked. With her hair still drenched, her eyes watering and her ruff panting, Carmen Lionheart seemed to really be appreciating her own appearance, only for her to suddenly slam her fist into the mirror. No, just what? Eugene asked once more. Carmen ended up passing through that mirror and arriving here. Ariartel's expression crumpled as she recalled that moment. Back then, Ariartel had actually been punched right in the eye by Carmen's fist, but she had no desire to allow such an incident to escape her lips. Ariartel continued, the alchemy gloves were something from my mother's lair, battle artifacts that could change their appearance in response to their owner's blood. I gave her those alchemy gloves as a reminder to keep our meeting a secret and as a tribute to a human with such outstanding talents. Deep down, she had actually hoped that Carmen would develop a good relationship with Alchester after receiving such a gift and knowing that a dragon was behind the Dragonic family. Carmen made a promise with Ariartel not to tell anyone, but that didn't matter as long as Carmen herself knew. For a family with a dragon watching them from behind the scenes, Ariartel didn't think that it would be too unconventional for Carmen to consider marrying a boy 12 years younger than her. Contrary to her wishes, however, Carmen hadn't married Alchester in the end. Alchester himself didn't have any romantic interest in Carmen. Ultimately, all that happened was that those precious alchemy gloves were reborn as heaven genocide in Carmen's hands. Why did she hit the mirror? Eugene asked, still confused. More than a few people would have gotten the feeling that their reflection in the mirror looked quite sexy after having taken a bath. But why would she then hit the mirror? More than anything else, Eugene just couldn't understand this fact.